After the Baltimore Clippers were eliminated from the playoffs by the Voyagers in 5 games on April 17, 1970, the heavily favored Montreal squad shockingly lost 3 straight games and were eliminated in a 5-game round-robin tournament with the Buffalo Bisons and Springfield Kings on May 3rd. The next day, 4 Kent State University students were killed when members of the Ohio National Guard opened fire on a crowd gathered to protest the Vietnam War. The 1966-67 Pittsburgh Hornets won the Calder Cup in the organization's final game before jumping to the NHL as the Penguins the following season. On May 13, 1970, the 69-70 Buffalo Bisons also won the Calder Cup in the team's final AHL game after sweeping Springfield in 4 straight before joining the NHL as the Sabres with the Vancouver Canucks to begin the 1970-71 season. Baltimore hockey fans must have felt cursed. It was bad enough watching smaller cities like Pittsburgh and Buffalo join the NHL while the Clippers were stuck in the American Hockey League, but did the hockey gods really need to let them win the Calder Cup too? Clipper fans felt that they got screwed by the NHL when the league expanded in 1967 and St. Louis and Pittsburgh were awarded teams instead of Baltimore. It was adding insult to injury for the Baltimore Clippers to serve as the subservient developmental team for the Pittsburgh Penguins. In a just world, Pittsburgh should have been the developmental team for the NHL's Baltimore Clippers. However, even though the NHL unfairly rigged the process in 1967 by awarding St. Louis a franchise, the real reason Baltimore never obtained an NHL team was simple. Baltimore was too cheap. Clipper owners Embry and Krieger deserve all the credit for bringing hockey to Baltimore in 1962. Without them, there never would have been a Clippers franchise. But they also deserve the blame for why Baltimore never joined the NHL. The league told Embry and Krieger over and over again that the Civic Center would need to add a few thousand seats, but neither the owners nor the city were willing to spend the money. That is why Pittsburgh got the final expansion team in 1967 and Baltimore didn't. Somewhere in the multiverse, I'm sure there's an alternate reality where Mario Lemieux, Jaromir Jagr, and Sidney Crosby would win 5 Stanley Cups playing as members of the Baltimore Clippers. And the Buffalo Sabres joined the NHL simply because the owners of the Clippers were unwilling to pay the required expansion team fee, which is why Dominik Hasek never won consecutive Hart trophies in a Clipper uniform. On May 24, 1970, Clippers general manager Terry Reardon announced that Baltimore was terminating its affiliation relationship with the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Clippers would be an independent club and would no longer be a developmental team. According to Reardon, there were times last year that we felt we weren't putting our best team on the ice because of having to follow the stipulations of a developmental team, which required them to play young prospects instead of more experienced veterans. Because Clippers coach Rudy McGay was under contract with Pittsburgh, he was reassigned to the Amarillo Wranglers of the Central League. GM Terry Reardon would once again assume coaching duties. The Clippers lost their captain when Wayne Hicks signed with the Salt Lake Golden Eagles of the Western League. After playing only 8 games, Hicks would be traded to the Phoenix Roadrunners, where he would play for 4 years, scoring 90 goals and winning the Lester Patrick Cup League Championship in his final 2 seasons. When Hicks's son Alex made his debut for Pittsburgh in 1996, it was the first time a father and son had played for the Penguins. Because of the end of the Clippers' affiliation agreement with Pittsburgh, Baltimore not only lost their coach, but many of their players from the previous year. Forwards Rick Kessel, Larry Billows, Gary Swain, and defenseman Yvon Lebray were demoted by Pittsburgh to the Amarillo Wranglers of the Central Hockey League. Although he was still a teenager when he was with the Clippers, Lebray would eventually develop into a star blue liner and captain for the Washington Capitals, who would retire his number in 1981. 4 Clippers were lost to the Buffalo Sabres in the 1970 expansion draft. With the 17th pick of the draft, the Sabres drafted the Clippers' most valuable player, defenseman Mike McMahon. McMahon would play only 11 games for the Sabres, who traded him to the Kings, who sent him back to the AHL. Mike would eventually play 4 seasons in World Hockey, primarily for the Minnesota Fighting Saints. Fellow Clipper defenseman Jean-Guy Legace was drafted by the Sabres with the 21st pick. He was traded back to Pittsburgh, who assigned him to Amarillo with his other former Clipper teammates. Winger Craig Cameron was taken by the Sabres with the 23rd pick, who immediately traded him to the St. Louis Blues, where he played the entire year. Cameron would then play 5 more seasons for the New York Islanders and Minnesota North Stars. And with the 27th pick of the draft, the Sabres took fan favorite brawler Doug Barry. Doug would play the entire 1970 season with Buffalo before being traded the following year to the Kings. In 1972, Doug Barry bolted to the Edmonton Oilers in the World Hockey Association's inaugural season and would play there for 5 years. Clipper goalie Joe Daly also went to Buffalo after the Sabres picked him up after he was waived by the Penguins. After playing a year in Detroit after being traded, Daly would gain fame in 1972 when he also bolted to the Winnipeg Jets for 7 seasons, winning 3 Avco Cup championships in the World Hockey Association as a teammate of the Golden Jet, Bobby Hull. As usual, the heart of the Baltimore Clippers were the players who were owned by the Clippers themselves instead of by an NHL team. The players owned by the Baltimore Clippers that were returning for the 70-71 season were forwards Jimmy Bartlett, Willie Marshall, Bobby Rivard, Jean-Marie Cassette, defenseman Wally Chevrier, and goalie Andy Brown. Versatile winger/defenseman Eddie McQueen also returned, but he would play only 15 games for Baltimore during the season, ending his long hockey career. Although Rod Zane was originally owned by the Clippers, during the postseason, Reardon sold Zane to the Pittsburgh Penguins, but with Baltimore retaining his minor league rights. Because of this, even though the affiliation agreement with Pittsburgh had been terminated, the Penguins still assigned Zane to the Clippers for the upcoming season. The Clippers also had George Swarbrick returning to the club. Swarby was owned by Pittsburgh when he played for Baltimore in 1969, but he was traded to the Philadelphia Flyers at the end of the season, who then lent him back to the Clippers. Terry Reardon spent much of the offseason attempting to find and buy players for the team. On June 12, 1970, 26-year-old forward Tony Goigan was poached by Reardon in the reverse NHL draft. Tony twice scored 20 goals in his 5 years with the Providence Reds and was a teammate of Bartlett's and Jimmy's final season playing in Rhode Island. Reardon also was able to poach in the draft right winger Marc Dufour from the Los Angeles Kings. The Frenchman from Trois-Rivières was originally owned by the New York Rangers. In 1959, when Bartlett was playing for New York, he complained about favoritism from coach Alf Pike shown to players from the Rangers' junior league affiliate in Guelph. At the time, Dufour was just one of many teenagers playing for the Guelph Biltmores, along with other future Clippers Bob Cunningham, Mike McMahon, Bobby Plager, and Jill Villemure, and future Hockey Hall of Famers Rod Gilbert and Jean Rattel. Doofy scored 7 goals in 38 games when he was first lent to the Clippers in 1963. During a short call-up by the Rangers, Dufour scored the only NHL goal of his career 8 days after President Kennedy was assassinated. In 1964, Dufour had 93 points and scored 43 goals and won the Central League Championship with the St. Paul Rangers. But in 1965, Dufour returned to the Clippers for a second tour of duty, but scored only 14 goals in the stronger AHL, and then only 19 goals for the Western League's Vancouver Canucks in 1966. After Dufour was drafted by Los Angeles in the 1967 expansion draft, he was sent to the Springfield Kings, where he rediscovered his goal-scoring touch. Dufour scored 20 goals with 45 points in 1967, 34 goals and 70 points in 1968, and 32 goals and 85 points in 1969. On July 31st, the Clippers were greatly improved on the blue line when Reardon bought veteran defenseman Kent Douglas from the Vancouver Canucks. Clipper trainer Gump Embro thought that Douglas was a weirdo. He's always against you. Contrary. You go in one bar, he goes in another. You say it was a good movie, he says it stunk. Kent Douglas previously was a teammate of Bartlett's when they won the Calder Cup 10 years earlier with Eddie Shore's Springfield Indians. While most of the team hated playing for the eccentric Eddie Shore and rebelled against the authoritarian team owner, the contrarian Douglas instead became his star pupil. In 1962, playing hockey the Eddie Shore way, Douglas became the first defenseman in history to win the NHL's Rookie of the Year and won the Stanley Cup as a member of the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Leafs were coached by Punch Imlock, who Douglas instead called George to get on his nerves. Contrarian. In 1967, Douglas was poached in the expansion draft by the California Golden Seals, who traded him to Detroit. After a year with the Red Wings, Douglas, who battled to control a weight problem his entire career, was sent back down to Rochester in the American League before his rights were then sold to Vancouver. Reardon also purchased the 24-year-old goalie Bob Whidden from the Rochester Americans to serve as backup to Andy Brown. In 1967, Whidden had won the Memorial Cup Junior Hockey League Championship with the Toronto Marlboros. Even though Baltimore was independent and was no longer considered to be a developmental team, Reardon was still able to arrange for the Detroit Red Wings to lend the Clippers some players for the 1970 season. The Detroit Red Wings provided Baltimore with a pair of players who both played the previous year for the Cleveland Barons. In 1969, Jim Niekamp played 46 games on the blue line, and Boston native John Cunniff scored 26 goals as rookies for Cleveland. Never playing junior hockey, Cunniff starred for 3 years at Boston College, where he was twice named All-American and led the Eagles to the NCAA Championship Finals. Cunniff played for the U.S. team at the 1968 Olympic Games in Grenoble, France. Cunniff wasn't the only college graduate that was lent to Baltimore by Detroit. After right winger Dave Ferguson played 3 seasons for Cornell, he scored 24 goals with the 1969 Syracuse Blazers of the low-level Eastern League before the Ivy Leaguer also joined the Clippers as a rookie. Detroit also sent to Baltimore Larry Johnston, a 27-year-old defenseman who the Red Wings had acquired via a trade with the LA Kings. Before joining the Clippers, Johnston developed a reputation as one of the toughest guys in the league during his 5 seasons in Springfield, leading the AHL in penalty minutes in both 1967 and 1968. Although I was really young at the time, I remember my sister Melinda being obsessed with Larry Johnston. I still have no idea why, but whenever we were in the car and would pass a Howard Johnson's restaurant, she would always point to it, start laughing, and say, "Let's eat at Larry Johnston's." Johnston was named the team's new captain, filling the vacancy created by the departure of Wayne Hicks. Detroit also sent Baltimore several rookies who had each played a couple of years for the Fort Worth Kings, defenseman Kerry Catter and centers Rick McCann and Fred Speck. It was the end of an era when the Clippers radio play-by-play man Jim West left WBAL to become the television voice of the Chicago Blackhawks. He was replaced by Ron Weber, Jimmy's teammate on the National Brewers softball team. I remember Jim West because he had the same name as my favorite character on television. I remember my mom and dad taking me to a car show at the Civic Center. Everybody was excited because the original Batmobile was there, along with celebrities James Brolin, Lee Majors, and Gregory Morris from Mission Impossible. But I didn't care because Robert Conrad from the Wild Wild West was there. I was grinning from ear to ear when he lifted me up right onto the stage and gave me an autographed picture of himself. Coming into training camp, Terry Reardon thought that the Clippers finally had a roster capable of finishing in first place. Jimmy had a good old time in camp. After all, he led the team in scoring the previous season and was hoping to have another big year. Bartlett came into training camp in great shape, 10 pounds lighter than the year before. According to Chief Clipper scout Aldo Guidolin, Bartlett looked sharp in drills. He was really digging in, and I hope he continues to work hard. According to Jimmy, "I was paired with Cunniff in the sprints, and he can go pretty fast. I knew I had to keep up with him, and I went all out." Even though Bartlett was small in stature, he had a reputation of being really strong. How strong? There were rumors that when he played in Providence, he was able to lift 3 guys off the ground at once. What are you talking about? On a bet, Bartlett was able to pick 3 teammates up in the air at the same time. No way. That's bullshit. No, it's true. I was there when he did it. You're just making that up. No, I'm telling you the truth. Bartlett can pick up 3 guys at once. Well, at least he used to be able to do it. I bet he still can do it. No way. Bet you $10. Make it 20. How about 50? Hey, what are you guys betting on? We got to bet that Bartlett can still pick up 3 guys off the ground. Well, I want in. Yeah, there's no way. Well, maybe when he was younger, but not now that he's old. I bet he still can do it. He's still strong as hell. You're crazy. Then put your money where your mouth is. It didn't take long before everybody on the team was placing bets on Bartlett's alleged feats of strength. Here were the rules. 3 players would be picked, not the biggest guys, not the smallest guys either. 3 average-sized players. The 3 players would lay on a sheet. Bartlett would grab the ends of the sheet and would try to lift the players off the ground. The rules were simple. Once Bartlett lifted his sheet off the ground, he only had to lift it high enough and long enough for another player to take a hockey stick and sweep it under the sheet without touching it. Jimmy was given a week to get into shape and practice before the big day. Somebody else was appointed to hold all the bets. Finally, the big day came. The players all gathered around in the locker room. The three players were all on their backs, lying next to each other on the sheet as Bartlett stood over them, taking deep breaths, preparing for the big moment. Here we go on the count of three. 1, 2, 3. On the count of three, the two players laying on the edge of the sheet locked arms and legs over the player in the middle. Jimmy would then start smiling. The rookie in the middle was trapped. Off would come his pants. A makeshift little noose would be made from a hockey lace and would be slipped over the rook's penis so it could be lifted without being touched. While one player worked the noose, another player would take a razor and would shave the victim. While the team roared with laughter, they would enhance the humiliation by smearing honey, molasses, eggs, hot sauce on him. The more the rook tried to fight back, the more likely he would get nicked by the razor. This hazing ritual was widespread and had been part of hockey culture for decades. Similar hazing rituals are common in other male-dominated groups. Experts have commented on the ironic nature of toxic masculinity and how there's a fine line between homophobia and homoeroticism. Although most players back in the 60s and 70s thought that this ritualistic shaving was just harmless fun, if it happened today, the participants would probably end up going to the slammer for false imprisonment and sexual abuse. Hazing wasn't the only improper thing that went on in the locker rooms. The greatest sin in professional sports also took place: gambling. According to Bartlett, hockey players would occasionally bet on the games. I don't know if it happened when he was on the Clippers or the Reds or some other team, but my dad told me that sometimes the team would place a bet on their own games. They didn't do it often, just when they thought it was important to promote team loyalty and spirit. Everybody would chip in $10 for the team to win, and they would place a group bet with a bookie. It wasn't because they were degenerate gamblers. Talk was cheap, so they were going to put their money where their mouth is. Nobody was going to slack when they all had skin in the game. Like the hazing ritual, peer pressure played a huge role. Even if getting caught meant the end of their careers, if veterans like Bartlett were willing to pull out their wallets, how could rookies ever say no? I know my mother couldn't stand Terry Reardon. When I was a little kid, I remember hearing my parents argue about him. She knew Jimmy and the other Clippers were underpaid and were being exploited by the owners. Unlike today, the players back then didn't have lawyers or agents to negotiate their contracts. General managers would call players into their office, sit them down, and tell them what their salary was going to be for the upcoming year. And if the players didn't like it, they were reminded that there were plenty of other hungry players who would be more than willing to take their place. So they better just smile and say thank you. Kelly thought Reardon was two-faced. He acted like he was on the side of the players and that they should all trust him to have their backs. But in the end, he always had the same old excuse, that his hands were tied because there wasn't enough money in the budget for any raises. She knew that Reardon's true allegiance was with the owners, not the players. But then again, that was his job, to sign the best players possible while paying them as cheaply as he could possibly get away with. With Kelly's encouragement, Jimmy demanded a pay raise, and of course Terry Reardon said, "Sorry, I wish I can help you, but I can't." So Bartlett refused to sign the contract and once again was a holdout when the season began, just like he had done the previous year when he missed the first 7 games of the season. Goalie Andy Brown also refused to sign a new contract. As a result, Reardon suspended both Brownie and Bartlett. As the team's leading point and goal scorer from the previous season, Bartlett thought that he had the upper hand in negotiations. However, the Clippers were able to still win their first 4 games of the season without him. Reardon told the press that by holding out, Bartlett and Brown were only hurting themselves and that it would be hard to find a roster spot for Jimmy since the team already had 3 other left wingers on the roster: Jean-Marie Cassette, Tony Goigan, and John Cunniff. On October 14, 1970, Bartlett signed a contract, ending his holdout. After losing the World Series to the Miracle Mets the year before, the Baltimore Orioles returned to the World Series after again dominating the American League with 108 wins. On October 15, 1970, the Orioles took the series after beating the Cincinnati Reds in 5 games. Hall of Famer Brooks Robinson batted .429 with a pair of homers and was awarded the series MVP. But he put on a clinic in the field, making one spectacular defensive play at hot corner after another. Pete Rose said that Brooks Robinson belongs in a higher league. Cincinnati's first baseman Lee May gave Robinson the nickname the Human Vacuum Cleaner and called him Mr. Hoover. "I'm beginning to see Brooks in my sleep," said Reds manager Sparky Anderson. "If I dropped this paper plate, he'd pick it up on one hop and throw me out at first." On October 19th, the crafty Reardon was able to bolster the Clippers roster when he obtained the high-scoring right winger Wayne Rivers. Rivers was originally owned by the Boston Bruins. He played the 1964 season with the Bruins and was called up for a couple of cups of coffee, but primarily played for the Hershey Bears, where he was lent in 1962 until he was drafted by the St. Louis Blues in the '67 expansion draft. He scored 37 goals for the 1965 Bears and was named the second-team All-Star the following year when he scored 30 goals in only 54 games. A late-season call-up by the Bruins, Moon Rivers scored in the team's final game, but it wasn't just the normal goal. Wayne Rivers' goal was the last goal ever scored in the NHL's Original Six era. After the Blues traded him to the New York Rangers, Rivers was lent to the Buffalo Bisons, where he had just won the Calder Cup. However, when the Rangers attempted to lend him to Seattle in the Western League at the beginning of the new season, Rivers refused to report. So while retaining his NHL rights, the New York Rangers allowed Rivers to sign a contract with the Baltimore Clippers. After a prowler was chased away from their residence in Gwen Oak, Jim and Kelly decided to move to a safer part of town, Cockeysville. Cockeysville is a community located in Baltimore County, which is famous for its limestone and marble quarry. The Washington Monument overlooking the National Mall in Washington, D.C. was made out of Cockeysville marble. My parents rented an apartment at the Yorktown Village Apartments, where we lived until 1974. At the time, the other Clippers were all living in Baltimore City, but after they saw our place in the suburbs, several other players decided to move to Cockeysville with their families. Bobby Rivard and new Clipper Marc Dufour also rented places at the Yorktown Village, the same apartment complex as us. Kent Douglas also rented an apartment in Cockeysville, but not at the Yorktown Village, but in the apartment complex across the street. Contrarian. The Rivards and Dufours were no longer just Clipper teammates, they became our neighbors, and Kelly became close friends with Beverly Rivard and Hillary Dufour. During a lifetime playing hockey, there was no other player that Jimmy was closer to than Bobby Rivard, and they remained friends for 50 years. In 1999, Jim and Kelly even flew to Quebec to surprise Bobby for his 60th birthday. Because Rivard was only 5'8", Bartlett teased him mercilessly about his height. Kelly loved to point out to Jimmy that he wasn't that much taller than Bobby, but it didn't matter. Until the day he died, whenever he saw a little person, Bartlett never missed the opportunity to point him out, cackle, and say, "Hey, there's Rivet." Theo Fleury, "There's Rivet." Tyler Johnston, "Rivet." All the jockeys at the track, the Munchkins in the Wizard of Oz, Tattoo on Fantasy Island, they were all Rivet. The Bartlett, Rivard, and Dufour families would frequently get together. When I was a little kid, I used to think that Bobby Rivard looked like Maxwell Smart. For some unknown reason, I have a distinct memory of playing the board game Concentration with Mike Rivard and Marc Dufour's daughters when we accidentally found it behind the sofa at Rivet's place while the grown-ups were busy eating and drinking and playing cards. Bobby Rivard had the reputation of being the best poker player on the Clippers, and he would regularly win his teammates' money in road trip poker games. According to Kelly, his wife Beverly was even better. Nobody could bluff better than Beverly Rivard. According to my mom, Bobby was a good Catholic boy, and she believed him when he told her that he attended Mass every Sunday, even when the team was traveling on the road, and would occasionally drag Bartlett to Mass with him. I don't know whether that's really true or not, or whether it just proves why the Rivards were so good at playing poker. While Marc Dufour was quiet and reserved, his wife was more extroverted. According to Kelly, Hillary was a highly intelligent college graduate who was completely bilingual in French and English and had worked as a flight attendant, which at the time was a really glamorous job for women. The three wives would sit together at the Clippers' home games. Sometimes I stayed home with the babysitter, but when I used to go to the games, the kids would normally get bored and look for every excuse to run wild around the Civic Center. I liked watching the Zamboni clean the ice and loved singing the Clipper fight song whenever somebody scored, but I had no idea about the rules of the game. But by far, my favorite part of the game was when all the players from both teams would suddenly clear the benches and rush out and throw their gloves all over the ice. Then everybody on the Clippers would grab someone on the other team and they would start slow dancing. All of the fans would jump out of their seat and yell, "Fight, fight, fight!" And the screaming wouldn't die down until all the players returned to their benches. I had no idea what was going on. I just thought it was a regularly scheduled part of the game. After failing to score in the Clippers' 4-1 win over the Springfield Kings, which was Jimmy's first game after missing 5 games because of his preseason holdout, Terry Reardon decided to start Bartlett on a line with Yorktown Village buddies Rivard and Dufour. On October 25, 1970, Baltimore won for the 6th time in 7 games when they defeated the Americans 4-1 in Rochester. According to the Baltimore Sun, the Clippers' offense belonged to veteran Jimmy Bartlett, who scored his first 2 goals of the season in the space of 38 seconds in the second period. Rivard had an apple, and Dufour assisted on both of Black Bart's goals. At the beginning of November, Bartlett scored in both of the Clippers' back-to-back road wins against Montreal and Cleveland. On November 8, 1970, an unhappy Rod Zane, who assumed he would be playing for Pittsburgh instead of Baltimore, told Terry he quit and demanded to be traded due to a lack of ice time. But Pittsburgh didn't trade him and didn't promote him. But since he didn't want to play for the Clippers in the AHL, the Penguins granted his wish by simply demoting him to the Central League's Amarillo Wranglers. Prior to the start of the season, Willie Marshall announced that he was definitely going to retire at the end of the year. He wanted to go out a winner, and he hoped he could break 3 AHL records in his final season. On November 13th, Willie Marshall assisted on goals from Jean-Marie Cassette and new Clipper defenseman Jim Niekamp in Baltimore's 6-1 blowout of the Montreal Voyageurs. Willie's 2 assists gave him a record 816 for his career, replacing Cleveland great Fred Glover as the AHL's all-time leader in assists. The next night, Hershey's rookie goaltender Dan Bouchard had 44 saves in a game that ended in a 1-1 tie. Bartlett scored the Clippers' only goal with assists from Speck and Rivers. It was Jimmy's 5th goal in 8 games. The Clippers were comfortably in first place, and it looked to everyone like Bartlett was on pace to have another great season. The annual Epicurean Sports Banquet was held on November 23, 1970 at the Udawood Gardens Banquet Hall in Towson. The guests of honor at the banquet were pitchers Jim Palmer of the Baltimore Orioles, middle linebacker Mike Curtis of the Baltimore Colts, forward Jack Marin of the Baltimore Bullets, and old Black Bart himself, Jimmy Bartlett. Kelly had a major crush on future Baseball Hall of Famer and jockey underwear model Jim Palmer. Jimmy once pranked Kelly by having Palmer call and flirt with her when she was home alone at the apartment in Cockeysville. She was beet red with embarrassment when she answered the phone and heard, "Hello, Kelly. This is Jim Palmer." A teammate of Dave Ferguson's at Cornell University was future Hall of Fame goalie Ken Dryden. The 23-year-old Dryden turned pro in 1970 and would play 33 games that year for the Montreal Voyageurs. On December 26, 1970, Baltimore and Montreal were tied 3-3 heading into the third period. Dryden was brilliant in the third period when he stopped Bartlett's solid bid with his skate. However, his brilliance couldn't stop Fred Speck from scoring the game's winner with assists from Bartlett and Chevy. Less than 3 months later, Dryden would be called up to the Canadiens. After winning all 6 games that he played for the Habs, Dryden earned the starting job for the playoffs. Despite setting an NHL record with 57 wins and 121 points on April 18, 1971, Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito's Boston Bruins were upset in a 7-game series by Dryden and the Canadiens. On May 18, 1971, less than 5 months after losing to the Baltimore Clippers at the Baltimore Civic Center, Ken Dryden was awarded the Conn Smythe Award as the most valuable player of the playoffs when the Canadiens defeated the NHL's Western Conference champs, the Chicago Blackhawks, starring Bobby Hall, Stan Mikita, and Tony Esposito, in 7 games to capture the Stanley Cup. In 1969, the Baltimore Clippers were a developmental team for the Pittsburgh Penguins that required them to play 7 players younger than 23. Reardon's risky decision to declare Baltimore's independence was an overwhelming success. The 1970 Baltimore Clippers would win 15 more games than they did the previous season and would finish the season with the best record of any team in the American Hockey League. At the end of the year, Reardon would win the Louis A.R. Perry Memorial Award and would be named the AHL's Coach of the Year. Terry gave most of the credit for the team's success to the improved play of the Clipper defense and goaltending. Andy Brown would be named the first-team All-Star as the league's best goalie, and Kent Douglas would be named the second-team All-Star at defense. The Clippers' top scoring line was the line of Speck, Bartlett, and Rivard. In the entire history of the Baltimore Clippers, no player would have a better season than Fred Speck. Speck would not only win Rookie of the Year, he would lead the entire league in scoring and was named the league's most valuable player. Wayne Rivard would score 38 goals, good for third in the league in scoring, and he would be named a second-team All-Star. Willie Marshall centered a line with Cunniff and Dufour on his wings. Both Cunniff and Dufour would score 31 goals. Dufour would finish second in the league in scoring, behind only Speck, and would also be named the first-team All-Star. Reardon's third line was centered by Rick McCann with Cassette, Rivard, Ferguson, and Swarbrick platooning on the wings. Jack Butterfield was Eddie Shore's right-hand man in Springfield for 20 years. After Shore sold the team in 1967, Butterfield became the president of the AHL. Despite the team's record, Butterfield still thought that the Clippers made a mistake when they chose to regain their independence rather than to continue as a developmental team. Baltimore's on top now, but you wonder how long they'll stay. Guys like Willie Marshall and Jim Bartlett and Jean-Marie Cassette are getting old. An independent team will have an exceedingly hard time getting new players because the National League keeps them all tied up. Reardon will have to evaluate his men carefully on the basis of age and ability. It will be a guessing game for him every summer. The Clippers greeted the new year with the best record in the AHL. However, after scoring 30 goals and leading the team in scoring the previous year, and after scoring 5 goals in his first 8 games, Bartlett hadn't scored since. And it didn't make any sense since he was playing on the red-hot line with Speck and Rivard. Al Fisher of the Baltimore Sun speculated that Jimmy had been snake-bit. In other words, Bartlett was simply the victim of some spectacular goaltending. But then again, maybe Jack Butterfield was right. Maybe Father Time had finally caught up to Black Bart. However, despite Bartlett's assurances that nothing was wrong and promises that the goals would once again start coming, Coach Reardon benched him after the Clippers' January 2nd loss to the Quebec Aces and replaced Jimmy on the Speck line with Tony Goigan in Baltimore's next game. Willie Marshall scored 2 goals in the first period, had an assist in the second period, and scored 2 more goals in the third period, where the Clippers beat the Rochester Americans 8-6 on January 9, 1971. When Marshall scored his second goal in the first period with assists from Dufour and Cunniff, it was the 1,338th point of his long career, breaking Fred Glover's record and making Willie Marshall the American Hockey League's all-time scoring leader. All that was left now was Fred Glover's record of 522 career goals, which Willie had every intention of breaking before the end of the season. On January 10, 1971, Jimmy finally ended his 21-game scoring drought when he scored in Baltimore's 4-1 win over the Rochester Americans. This goal moved Bartlett past Fred Thurier into 7th place on the AHL's all-time goal-scoring list. It was Jimmy's first goal since he had scored the Clippers' only goal in their November 14th tie against Hershey 2 months earlier. My mom normally went to the hockey games on Friday night, and she and Bartlett would go out to dinner in Little Italy afterwards. I would normally stay home with the babysitter, which I didn't mind because we would watch the Friday night comedy lineup of The Brady Bunch, The Partridge Family, That Girl, The Odd Couple, and then Love American Style. Now, when my parents were home, there were several shows that we would watch together as a whole family. I remember we'd all gather around our big Magnavox color TV and watch Laugh-In, The Flip Wilson Show, and To Tell the Truth. But the one show that we never, ever missed made its debut on January 12, 1971. The groundbreaking comedy All in the Family brilliantly explored the tensions of the era and centered on the generational clash between the conservative, blue-collar, bigoted Archie Bunker and his liberal son-in-law, Meathead. In the Clippers' next game, Bartlett was penalized after getting into a stick fight with Bears goalie Andre Gill and was later thrown out of the game after arguing a call with the referee on a pile-up in the crease in front of the Hershey goal. With the banished Bartlett sitting in the dressing room, the Clippers beat the Bears 4-3 after Bobby Rivard scored the winning goal with a minute left of the game after replacing Bartlett on the Speck and Rivers line. On January 17, 1971, Bartlett scored in the Clippers' 5-3 win over the Providence Reds. I doubt many people in Baltimore paid much attention to the game because they were probably watching the Baltimore Colts defeat the Dallas Cowboys 16-13 in Super Bowl V. Although the season was now more than halfway over, Bartlett scored only 7 goals and still hadn't scored a single goal at home. Reardon was puzzled because he thought Jimmy was usually dynamite at home. Supportive Baltimore fans of Black Bart sent him lucky pennies, rabbit feet, and cigars with the hope of breaking his slump. By January 22nd, the Clippers easily had the best record in the American Hockey League and had opened up a 12-point lead over the second-place Cleveland Barons, who they were scheduled to play that night at the Civic Center. Although the Clippers were easily beaten 6-2 by the Barons, Jimmy finally scored his first goal at home in Baltimore's 40th game of the season. Black Bart's goal moved him past his friend and former Providence Red teammate, Bruce Klein, for 6th place on the AHL's all-time goal-scoring list. At the end of the month, the Philadelphia Flyers reassigned George Swarbrick to the Hershey Bears. Terry Reardon also decided to send Bartlett to the bench where he would be used just as a spare. He was replaced on the Speck and Rivers line with Jean-Marie Cassette. Bartlett didn't even dress for the team's next 2 road games against Springfield and Providence. Bartlett dressed but sat on the bench without playing during most of the Clippers' next game against the Rochester Americans on February 13th. With the score tied at 2, Reardon decided to put the old gunslinger into the game in its final minutes. Playing his only shift of the night, at 15:23 of the third period, Black Bart was Johnny on the spot and one-handed the loose puck into the net for the game winner, drawing the popular Bartlett a long round of applause. Despite being the game's hero, Bartlett was once again back on the bench for the Clippers' next game against the Montreal Voyageurs. Although the Baltimore crowd kept screaming for their hero throughout the game, Reardon didn't hear a thing, and Bart continued his stretch on the bench where he sat for the next 4 games. He didn't even get any ice time in the Clippers' 14-0 blowout of the Springfield Indians that occurred on February 21st, 1971. The Clippers won their 7th straight game on February 25th, 1971. Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap the Morris mechanic in a single bound. Look down on the ice, it's Jimmy Bartlett. According to the Baltimore Sun, a mere 46 seconds after stepping out of his phone booth, better known as the Clippers bench, where he warmed his butt for 4 games, Super Bart dug the puck out of the corner and fed Fred Speck with a perfect pass which gave the Clippers a 2-1 lead in the second period. 3 minutes later, Bartlett was on the ice again. This time he took a pass from Speck behind the Hershey goal, paused momentarily, then poked the puck in front of Wayne Rivers for another easy goal. With the score now 3-1, Jim Bartlett, the super player, resumed the secret identity of James Bartlett, the bench warmer, to be held in abeyance until being summoned by secret Dakota wing, of course, by Clipper coach Terry Reardon. After the game, Black Bart was interviewed in the dressing room and told the press with his characteristic smile and devilish wink, "Yep, I was thrown in there just long enough to give the boys a spark." Terry said, "I was saving Jimmy for the right spot, and I felt at the start of the second period it was time to throw him in there." The Clippers had by far the best record in the league and were sitting comfortably in first place in the Western Division with a record of 35 wins and 13 losses with 5 ties. On February 26, 1971, brilliant goaltending from Andy Brown and Serge Aubry resulted in a 0-0 tie between the Clippers and the Rochester Americans. Bartlett had the best chance of the night midway in the second period when he got loose on a breakaway. He skidded right in on Aubry, but as it has been the case much of the season, Bartlett was thwarted, Aubry gloving Jimmy's backhander and holding on. Snake bit once again. On March 29, 1971, Wayne Rivers had a 4-goal game, and the Clippers scored 5 times in the third period to come back to tie the Quebec Aces 7-7. According to the Baltimore Sun, A lot of credit must go to Jimmy Bartlett, who came off the bench to spark the comeback. In the third period, Baltimore was trailing 5-4 when Rivard scored the tying goal with some brilliant work by Jim Bartlett. With the Clippers again trailing 7-6, with Quebec's Dave the Hammer Schultz in the penalty box, Bartlett and Speck picked up assists on Wayne Rivard's tying goal. On March 23rd, Jimmy was promoted from bench duty and played on a regular line for the first time in 6 weeks in the Clippers matchup against the Providence Reds at the Baltimore Civic Center. After Alton White scored in the first period to give the Reds a 1-0 lead, Bartlett, taking a beautiful pass from Wayne Rivers, tied the game 41 seconds later. In the second period, with the score tied at 2, Bartlett assisted on a goal by Speck. In the third period, Bartlett assisted on a goal by Rivers after he inspected the heavy work of digging the puck out of the corner, and later scored the game's final goal for a 4-point night in the Clippers' 6-3 win over Providence. On March 28th, Jimmy was one of 6 different Clippers to score in Baltimore's 6-4 win against the Quebec Aces. In their next game, Bartlett scored on the backhander in the Clippers' 7-3 win at the Civic Center to clinch first place for the first time in Baltimore's history. With Baltimore winning both the World Series and the Super Bowl, it felt as if the Clippers were destined to win the Calder Cup. The Clippers were shut out 5-0 in their next game, a meaningless game against the Hershey Bears. In the third period, Bartlett crushed Hershey's 21-year-old winger, Gene Grattan, with Jim pulling the jersey over the head routine and landing several solid right hands. On April 2nd, the Clippers defeated Hershey in a Baltimore home game. After Wayne Rivers left the game following a collision with Hershey's goalie Dan Bouchard, his replacement Bobby Rivard came off the bench and scored the winning goal after taking a pass from Bartlett while on a 2-on-1 breakaway. Willie Marshall was still chasing the one record of Fred Glover that he still hadn't broken. With 521 career AHL goals, Willie needed only one more goal to tie Glover for the all-time lead. Marshall's teammates tried to help him by passing the puck to him all night long. The crowd chanted, "We want Willie!" But Marshall had been on the ice for a 3-minute stint, and it was Jim Bartlett who got the open net goal after Hershey pulled the goalie Dan Bouchard with the score 3-2. A new Clipper record, however, was broken in the game. Fred Speck's 2 points in the game broke Willie Marshall's single-season scoring record for the team. Willie would finish the season with only 15 goals and 521 in his career, 1 goal short of Fred Glover's league record. The Clippers finished the season with the best record in the American Hockey League. Baltimore's 89 points and 40 wins were new club records. Speck set a new Clipper record, finishing the season with 92 points. Andy Brown tied Jill Villamer's record of 4 shutouts, and team captain Larry Johnston broke Bobby Plager's team record of 198 penalty minutes. Baltimore was scheduled to play the Providence Reds in the first rounds of the playoffs. On paper, the Clippers were heavily favored because although the Reds finished in first place in the East, they had 12 fewer wins than the Clippers. However, Baltimore wasn't playing their best hockey, winning only 5 of their final 19 games. Reardon felt it was just bad luck and said, "I don't think we were in any slump. We worked just as hard as we always have, but the puck just didn't break our way." He said that his players said that they were going to win the championship. Now we have half of it. The division title, now we want the rest of it, the Calder Cup. Kent Douglas said, "I've been on 3 American League champions and 3 National League champions, but this team has to be one of the best I've ever been associated with." Black Bart said, "My first year in the American League, I played for Terry and we won the Calder Cup, and now we're going to do it again." The Clippers were headed to the playoffs without defenseman Jim Niekamp, who was recalled to Detroit near the end of the season. Black Bart played for many different teams and had many teammates during his long hockey career. AHL Hall of Fame goalie Marcel Paillet was the only player who was a teammate of Bartlett on 4 different teams: the New York Rangers, Providence Reds, Springfield Indians, and the Matan Red Rocks. Ironically, Jimmy scored more goals in his game against Paillet than he did against any other goalie. Paillet had been the Reds goalie since 1966, and Bartlett loved to punish the only team that ever traded him. The Clipper fans fueled the animosity between the two teams in Game 1 at the Civic Center. One of the many banners hanging from the upper deck said, "I'd rather be dead than a Providence Red." The game was filled with penalties with 69 penalty minutes called, and there were at least 6 fights. Twice during the game, 5 players were in the penalty box at the same time. After one scramble in front of the net, Paille threw the puck at Jimmy Bartlett's head. With the score tied at 1, Providence rookie Ron Gorwasiak knocked in a rebound for the game winner. Though Andy Brown played very well, Paille played brilliantly, making 33 saves. The Clippers threw everything at him in the final period, and Rivard hit the pipe in the game's final minutes, but the Reds were able to hold on and take Game 1. The Clippers were able to tie the series after Andy Brown shut out the Reds 3-0 in Game 2 of the series. The third game played in the barn in Providence was action-packed from beginning to end, but the Clippers blew a 4-3 lead when former Clipper Nick Polano tied it at the end of the second period, and the Reds added 2 more in the third to defeat Baltimore 6-5 in Game 3. Providence kept relentless pressure on the Clippers throughout Game 4 and were able to defeat Baltimore 5-3 after scoring 3 goals within the space of 2 minutes in the second period. During the game, Paille was able to stop Bartlett's backhander after Jimmy got hold of the puck and skated into the crease. After Wayne Rivers and Fred Speck put the Clippers ahead 2-0 in the first period, Andy Brown had 39 saves and the Clippers were able to hang on in Game 5 to avoid elimination with a 4-2 win. In Game 6, the younger, faster, and hungrier Providence Reds completely dominated the lethargic Baltimore Clippers, outshooting them 51-18. Paille and the Reds humiliated the Clippers with a 3-0 victory, eliminating them from the playoffs. The Willie Marshall, John Cunniff, and Marc Dufour line did not score a single goal in any of the games. At the end of the game, Willie the Whip skated off the ice for the last time with 51 seconds left, sat at the end of the Clipper bench, and bowed his head after checking the scoreboard. "That's it," Marshall said after the game. "I'm not changing my mind. That's my final hockey game." After the loss, all a phased Terry Reardon could say was, now I have to go out and get a whole bloody new team." Despite having a losing record during the regular season, the Springfield Kings, led by the 19-year-old future Hall of Fame goalie Billy Smith, swept the Reds in the finals to win the Calder Cup. Bartlett also failed to score any goals in the series despite his history of dominating Paille. During his career, Jimmy Bartlett's mantra was that he would hang up the skates if he ever scored less than 20 goals in a season. However, after leading the team with 30 goals the year before, Bartlett found the back of the net only 14 times. The press assumed that Black Bart had played his final game and would retire like Willie Marshall. Maybe the Civic Center was jinxed. On April 30th, 1971, the Baltimore Bullets, the Clippers' co-tenant at the Baltimore Civic Center, were swept in 4 games in the NBA Finals by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and the Milwaukee Bucks. At the end of the season, the Quebec Aces relocated to Virginia and were renamed the Richmond Robins, and the Montreal Voyageurs moved to Nova Scotia. The AHL also added 3 new franchises for the 1971-72 season: the Boston Braves, the Cincinnati Swords, and the Tidewater Kings, who were based in Norfolk, Virginia. Several of the Clippers who were owned by Detroit were sent to the Red Wings' New Virginia Farm Club. Third-line forwards Rick McCann and Dave Ferguson and defenseman Jim Niekamp were assigned to the Tidewater Wings. Defenseman Kerry Ketter was traded by Detroit to the Montreal Canadiens, who sent him to the Voyageurs. Clipper captain Larry Johnston would also begin the season in Tidewater, but would spend the majority of the year playing for Detroit in the NHL. Kent Douglas replaced Johnston as Baltimore's new team captain. In June, the Clippers also lost their MVP Fred Speck, who was poached by the Vancouver Canucks from the Red Wings in the intra-league draft. Speck would play 8 games with the 1971-72 Canucks, but after scoring only once, would be sent back to the minors. Although he would spend some time playing world hockey, Speck would never come close to matching the success of his MVP season. The Clippers also lost their star goalie Andy Brown to the Detroit Red Wings, who poached him in the summer's interleague draft. He would play 10 games in Detroit, but would spend most of the year with the team's affiliates in Tidewater and Fort Worth. After being traded, Brownie would become the Penguins' starting goaltender in 1973 before ending his career in 1977 with the Indianapolis Racers of the World Hockey Association, never wearing a goalie mask. The Clippers also lost players that weren't owned by Detroit. The New York Rangers traded 38-goal scorer Wayne Rivers to the LA Kings, who would assign him to their affiliate in Springfield for the 71-72 season, where he would lead the AHL in goals with 48 and would be named the first-team All-Star. Rivers would eventually play 5 seasons in the World Hockey Association, where he enjoyed great success, especially in San Diego, where he scored 54 goals with 107 points in 1974. John Cunniff would head to the Rochester Americans for the 1971 season, but would spend most of the 70s playing in the low-level North American Hockey League. Cunniff would eventually coach the Hartford Whalers, the New Jersey Devils, and the AHL's Albany River Rats, and would be the assistant coach for the 1994, 1998, and 2002 U.S. Olympic teams, which would result in his induction into the United States Hockey Hall of Fame in 2003. Terry Reardon and team scout Aldo Guidolin spent the summer hunting for players to sign or buy. In June, the Clippers poached veteran Red Armstrong from the Kings organization. Red was originally part of the Maple Leafs organization and played 7 games with that team in 1962. Armstrong scored a goal on his very first shift with the Leafs, but it would be his only NHL goal. After his brief stint in the NHL, Red Armstrong would play the next 9 years for the Rochester Americans. Red was always willing to drop the gloves, and although he was one of the most popular players to ever play for Rochester, he was thought of as a villain by the fans of the other American League teams. He twice scored 30 goals and was a core member of the Rochester Americans' 3 Calder Cup championship teams. In 1970, Red was traded to the LA Kings, who assigned him to Springfield, where he won the Calder Cup for a 4th time. A pair of wingers who were teammates of Armstrong in Springfield also came to Baltimore from the Kings. Reardon bought the rights to Brian Murphy, a 24-year-old 6'3" left winger who had played 3 seasons for Springfield, and signed winger Doug Russo, who was a rookie on the Kings Calder Cup championship team, after winning back-to-back championships with the Dayton Gems of the International League. The Clippers also strengthened their defensive core when the team signed veteran defenseman Jean Gauthier, who had played 166 games in the NHL with the Montreal Canadiens, Boston Bruins, and Philadelphia Flyers. Although Gauthier never played a regular season game for the Montreal Canadiens, his name is engraved on the Stanley Cup after he appeared in 2 playoff games for Montreal during their 65 championship run. Jean, also a member of the Seattle Totems when they won the Western League's championship in 1967, before he joined the Montreal Voyageurs for 2 years. Reardon also signed rookie goalie Jim Shaw as a backup for Bob Whiddon after the former Blackhawks prospect was released by the Western League's Portland Buckaroos. At the time, the most controversial owner in professional sports was Charles Finley. Charlie O bought the horrific Kansas City Athletics and moved them to Oakland, California in 1968. The eccentric Finley replaced the team's traditional elephant mascot with a mule named after himself and experimented by having the team play with orange baseballs and paid Raleigh Fingers a $300 bonus to grow his famous handlebar mustache. Finley made the 13-year-old Bat Boy the team's executive vice president, whose job was to act as Finley's eyes and ears when the owner was back home in Chicago. The kid was given the nickname Hammer by Reggie Jackson because he looked like a young Hank Aaron. In 1990, he would grow up to become a rap music superstar with the song You Can't Touch This. In 1970, Finley decided to try his hand in hockey and bought the NHL's Oakland Seals and renamed them the California Golden Seals. Terry Reardon reached an agreement with Finley's California Golden Seals to lend the Clippers players for the 1971-72 season, replacing the agreement they had with the Providence Reds, who had just lost the Calder Cup Finals to Springfield. The Golden Seals provided the Clippers with the 32-year-old veteran center Joe Szura. When Szura was a young prospect with the Montreal Canadiens organization, there were hopes that the gifted 6'3" playmaking center would develop into the new Jean Beliveau. However, Szura's lack of speed and physicality prevented him from reaching those lofty expectations. Joe played 5 years for the Cleveland Barons from 1962 until 1966, where he scored 20 goals 4 straight years and won the Calder Cup in 1964. Szura's best season was in 1965, when he scored 46 goals and was a first-team All-Star. After he was drafted by the Golden Seals in the 1967 expansion draft, Szura played for the Buffalo Bisons before playing the entire 68 season with California in the NHL, but he scored only 9 goals. After being lent to the Reds the following year, Szura scored 20 goals the next 2 seasons before joining the Clippers. Dick Matuzzi was a teammate of Szura during his 5-year stint with Cleveland. The hard-nosed, grinding defenseman had played 2 years with Rochester before joining the Barons in 1962. In 1967, the Pittsburgh Penguins bought the veteran blue liner from the Barons and traded him to the Golden Seals the following year. After playing 3 years in the NHL with California, the Seals sent him to Baltimore to begin the 1971 season. The 29-year-old Howie Menard had the grit and speed that Joe Szura lacked. He also had a hell of a slap shot, but unlike the 6'3" Szura, Menard stood only 5'7" and was smaller than even Rivard. Howie was the captain of the 61-62 Hamilton Red Wings, which won the Memorial Cup as the champions of junior hockey that year. Howie turned pro the following season, scoring 16 goals as a 20-year-old rookie with the Pittsburgh Hornets. In 1965, after playing a few years in the Central League, the Red Wings prospect was poached by Springfield in a special draft. After the LA Kings bought the Springfield franchise, Howie would spend 2 seasons primarily with Los Angeles in the NHL. Howie was poached by the Blackhawks in 1969, who traded him to the California Seals for Gene Ubriaco. Menard played the entire 1970 season on loan to Providence before being reassigned to the Baltimore Clippers. Finally, the Clippers received 4 young players: 21-year-old left winger Pete Laframboise, 20-year-old right winger Hilliard Graves, and 20-year-old defenseman Ted McAneely, all played for the Reds in 1970. The Seals also sent Baltimore the 21-year-old left winger John French, who played for the Montreal Voyageurs in 1970 before being traded to California. I remember that my dad used to sing while driving home after the hockey games. He would look at the sky and sing, "I see the moon and the moon sees me. I like the moon and the moon likes me." He would change the lyrics of Glenn Campbell's Wichita Linesman and would sing, "I am a linesman for the Clippers." He also loved to sing one line from the Doors classic in a deep voice, "Come on, baby, light my fire." On July 3, 1971, the 27-year-old singer Jim Morrison was found dead in his bathtub in Paris. Former Clipper Jim Morrison, meanwhile, was alive and well, having spent 2 seasons playing for the Pittsburgh Penguins since they bought him from Baltimore. On October 14th, Mr. Mojo Rison returned to the Clippers after Reardon bought him back. On August 26, 1971, Terry Reardon held a press conference and predicted that the Clippers' upcoming season would be even better than the previous one. He introduced 3 players that he said would form the nucleus of the team: Kent Douglas, Red Armstrong, and Jimmy Bartlett, who decided not to retire. Filling out the team's roster were the players owned by the Clippers: forwards Bobby Rivard, Marc Dufour, Jean-Marie Cassette, and Tony Goigan, defensemen Kent Douglas and Wally Chevrier, and goalie Bob Whitten. After thinking about it during the summer, Willie Marshall changed his mind and decided not to retire, so at the beginning of September he informed Terry Reardon that he intended to return to the Clippers for 1 more season. Even though Marshall only scored 15 goals in 1970, the playmaking veteran center still finished 9th in the AHL in assists. However, on September 19th, the Clippers announced that Willie Marshall, who needed just 2 goals to become the all-time leading goal scorer in the American Hockey League, had been given his outright release. At the time of his unceremonious release, Marshall was also the Baltimore Clippers' all-time leading scorer. According to the Baltimore Sun, Jim Bartlett was in top form during training camp. On September 23rd, he scored 3 goals in an inter-squad game and scored a goal the next night in the Clippers' 5-1 dominant preseason win over the Hershey Bears. Bartlett told the press,
"I've worked hard in practice, scored in just about every game I've played in, and done everything I could to show that I want to make this team. I really think that I can help this club, and if I get cut, it'll be a crime.
The Clippers played their first game of the season against the Rochester Americans on October 9, 1971. 4 days before the season began, Terry Reardon cut Tony Gowigan, who would play for the Thunder Bay Twins in the semi-pro United States Hockey League. Reardon also cut longtime Clipper great Jean-Marie Cassette, who then retired as the Clippers' second all-time leading scorer. Reardon said afterwards, "Cutting a squad is never an easy job, but this year has been the toughest time I've ever had." On October 5, 1971, Reardon made his final cut when he released the Baltimore Clippers' most popular player, Jimmy Bartlett. Like all players of his day, Bartlett had a job during the offseason. Jimmy drove a beer truck and delivered beer for the National Brewing Company, the sponsors of his softball team. Bringing kegs of beer to the local bars not only helped him stay in shape, it also allowed Bartlett to interact with the fans in the community who were excited to socialize with their local hockey hero, further increasing his popularity. He may have been old, but his popularity had never been higher. His old fan club that was established in the 1950s during his days as a Ranger continued to honor him through the 1970s with a yearly banquet in New York, and these loyal fans never stopped making road trips to different venues to support their favorite player. After getting cut from the team, Jimmy continued to work on the beer truck. On October 15, 1971, he took me to Memorial Stadium, which was on his route. The Baltimore Orioles were playing in their third consecutive World Series and were practicing that day. Since everybody knew Black Bart, it was no problem for me to get down on the field. My dad gave me 2 baseballs and a ballpoint pen. He would point to different players and I would walk up to them and ask them to sign my baseballs. On the one ball, I got every member of the 1971 Baltimore Orioles. On the other ball, I got every member of the 1971 Pittsburgh Pirates, including Roberto Clemente. The Baltimore Sun took a picture of Clemente taking batting practice. Standing behind him was Black Bart, and next to Jimmy Bartlett is the profile of a little boy staring at Roberto's butt. It was the first time I was ever in the newspaper. 2 days later, the Pittsburgh Pirates won the World Series. Although the signatures on the baseball eventually faded and the baseballs today are worthless, the memory of that moment remains and is priceless. Determined to fulfill his quest of breaking the AHL's record for all-time goals after he was cut by the Clippers, Willie Marshall attended the Rochester Americans training camp. Although he was unable to make the team, Willie refused to quit. Since the players in the Central League were all owned by the NHL, Marshall's only option for him was to play in the International League. If he could prove himself in the IHL, he was hoping Rochester would give him a chance. Although the players in the International League were paid meager salaries, the league was officially considered to be an amateur league. By the 1980s, the International League would evolve from being a semi-pro league into a professional minor league rival, almost the equal in quality to the AHL. But in 1971, the International League was basically the United States equivalent of senior hockey. Willie Marshall joined the Toledo Hornets, determined to earn his way back into the league that he dominated for the past 2 decades. Because the Clippers had limited roster space and operated on a tight budget, Reardon's responsibilities as general manager required him to make difficult and unpopular decisions. However, he thought that he had a duty to the players who he had cut from the squad at training camp. Reardon would do his best to find roster spots on other teams in various leagues for the players that he had to let go. But because Bartlett was released just a few days before the season began, it was too late for Jimmy to join any other American League teams. He was gassed. The Central League wasn't an option because all the teams and players were owned by the NHL. Like Willie Marshall, if he wanted to keep playing, Bartlett's only option was to head to the International League. One thing that definitely wasn't an option was quitting. Jimmy originally got involved in hockey at the age of 6 because he envied the bright jackets the kids got for playing on the team.
"I don't even know how to talk about it,"
he confesses,
"other than to simply say, I play hockey. I don't know what the big words mean anyway. I'm hockey. That's all. It's all I know."
During the offseason, Charlie Finley acquired the franchise rights to the folded Columbus Checkers of the International Hockey League, which he intended to use as California's farm club. The new Columbus Seals joined the International League as an expansion team to begin the new season. Reardon made a few calls. Maybe the Seals would like an old veteran like Bartlett to work with the young amateurs. After Willie Marshall and Jimmy Bartlett filed the necessary paperwork to reinstate their status as amateur hockey players, they both were headed to the state of Ohio. Kelly wasn't happy that Jimmy was heading to Columbus and would be away from the family. Bartlett told her that he was going to be a player coach for the Seals. I don't know if Bartlett really thought he would be coaching the team or if he just made that up so Kelly would let him go, but there was never any intention of Columbus to allow Bartlett to coach. He was simply a player 6 months shy of his 40th birthday. The rest of the team were just a bunch of kids, most of them younger than 21. The team played in an old arena named the Coliseum at the Ohio State Fairgrounds. During his time playing for Columbus, Bartlett resided in an Ohio State University dorm room. Bartlett played his first game with the Columbus Seals on October 23, 1971, who were beaten on the road by the Dayton Gems 5-2. On October 30th, Columbus was defeated 7-3 by the Toledo Hornets. In that game, Willie Marshall scored an unassisted goal at 0:24 of the second period. Not wanting to be shown up by his old friend, Bartlett scored his first goal with his new team at 4:39 of the same period. Bartlett had nothing in common with his much younger teammates. Bartlett was married with children and began playing hockey professionally while his teammates were all still in diapers. The last time Jimmy had played in the International League was in 1952, when he had won the league championship as part of the Cincinnati Mohawk dynasty. On November 8, 1971, Led Zeppelin released their fourth album, which featured the hard rock classic Stairway to Heaven. The last time Jimmy was in the International League, the number one song in America was Look at That Doggy in the Window by Patti Page. According to the Cincinnati Enquirer, Bartlett is 5'10", 175 pounds, a hopeless braggart, a one-way player who lives to score goals, and is an unusual man with unbeatable pride. His indignity at the season's start was compounded by the blowhard image he had with younger players.
In the old days, I'd go out and get a couple of girls, have a little party, get loaded, and then the next day score 2 goals.
Boasts Bartlett.
Really, I guess it's that we're crazy, all of us. Hockey players aren't like football players or baseball players. Curfews isn't for us. I've had 200 stitches in the head and face, but it's a good life.
Most of his young teammates were not impressed with Bartlett's bravado, finding him pathetic, not inspirational. Bartlett drew as much laughter as he did respect, this old hanger-on so far behind the times. When Jimmy was younger, many of his teammates were heavy drinkers and alcoholism was a serious problem in the league. But now, some of the kids would go off on their own to smoke what Bartlett assumed was marijuana. Jimmy wasn't sure what they were smoking or if they were using any harder drugs. Bartlett just stayed away from that sort of thing and successfully isolated himself from any drug use by his teammates. Bartlett's only exposure to drugs was when the Baltimore Clippers team doctor would distribute amphetamines to the players. The Benzedrine pills were called Bennies by the players, and they were normally handed out to the team during road trips, which allowed the players to have more energy, skate faster, and play more aggressively. Most of the players, especially the older ones, including Bartlett, reluctantly acquiesced and consumed the stimulants out of fear that they would be physically disadvantaged against all of the players who had no reservations using performance-enhancing drugs. Jimmy scored in the November 12th tie against the Port Huron Wings, and again the next night in a battle of the league's 2 last-place teams, which the Seals lost 7-6 to Toledo. Less than 1,000 fans showed up to watch. In his first game back after coming out of retirement, former Clipper teammate Billy LeCain scored for Port Huron in an ugly match that ended with the bench-clearing brawl. 129 penalty minutes were handed out, and Bartlett was one of the 5 players ejected from the game, along with Columbus coach Terry Gray. Jimmy scored the next night, but this time another old friend from the Clippers scored the game winner for the Wings, Bob Brinkworth. On November 21st, Toledo's Willie Marshall scored the unassisted game-winning goal at 16:59 of the third period. This was the last time that longtime teammates Jimmy Bartlett and Willie Marshall would ever play in the same game. On November 25th, 1971, the Fort Wayne Comets defeated Columbus 7-2. It was the 14th game that Jimmy had played with the team. During that time, Bartlett scored 4 goals and had 10 points, but the Seals failed to win a single game. The team was just terrible, and Bartlett was miserable. He missed his home, he missed his wife, he missed me, and he missed his miniature dachshund, who I named Clipper. So he quit. Jimmy just packed his bags and returned home to Baltimore. 2 nights later, he was in attendance at the Civic Center with Kelly, where he watched his former team beat the Tidewater Wings. The Clippers had been off to a rough start, only winning 7 of their first 23 games. Even though Columbus and the International League were no longer an option, Bartlett still refused to give up. On December 6th, Bobby Rivard was honored by the Epicureans. Bartlett showed up at the dinner to the surprise of everyone who knew that Jimmy was supposed to be in Columbus.
I quit Columbus because I want to play here with the Clippers, Bartlett said frankly enough. I couldn't stand it in Columbus. They had a bunch of kids on the club, and while I was there, we lost 15 straight. I'm going to talk to Terry Reardon about rejoining the Clippers. They need some goal scorers.
Less than a week later, Bartlett signed a new contract. Unfortunately for Jimmy, it wasn't with the Clippers. Apparently, Reardon wasn't interested in bringing back Bartlett. Instead, Jimmy signed a contract to play for the National Brewers of the local Chesapeake Hockey League. During the 1970s, the Chesapeake Hockey League was the top amateur league in the state of Maryland. Unlike the semi-pro International League, the Chesapeake Hockey League was truly an amateur league. The players didn't get paid a dime, but were just playing for the love of the game. The National Brewers hockey team was sponsored by Jimmy's employer during the off-season, the National Brewing Company, who also sponsored Bartlett's softball team. The Brewers played their home games at the Orchard Ice Rink in Towson, where the Baltimore Clippers held their practices. Bartlett had played in the Stanley Cup Finals for the Montreal Canadiens against Gordie Howe and the Detroit Red Wings. Now he was going to be playing against teams named the Orchard Mercuries, Diamond Rio, and the Baltimore Junior Clippers. The Chesapeake League also had teams with players from the University of Maryland and the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. The Baltimore Sun said it was comparable to a former boxing champion winding up fighting in neighborhood clubs. But Jimmy didn't complain. He knew he was doing what he loved best, playing hockey. Jimmy played center in his first game with the Brewers on December 12, 1971, in a game against the Orchard Mercuries. The Mercury successfully executed the strategy of preventing Bartlett from getting the puck by shadowing him the entire game and shutting out the Brewers 4-0. Jimmy noticed that his teammates played as if they were in awe of having a famous professional player on the team, and told them after the loss that, "As soon as you fucking guys start treating me like one of the rest of yous, we'll start playing like a team." After the teams lost to the Mercuries, in order to prevent other teams from shadowing Jimmy, he switched positions from center to becoming a defenseman so he could quarterback the offense with exciting rink-length rushes. The switch was successful, and the Brewers started to come together as a team. Jimmy played 10 games with the Brewers. Unlike his time playing in Columbus, Bartlett was happy again. He was back at home with his family, and he really bonded with his new National Brewery teammates. Unlike his resentful Columbus teammates who were unwilling to tap into Jimmy's deep well of hockey knowledge because they considered him to be just an old, washed-up has-been, the young guys on the Brewers were excited to have a former NHL player as a teammate and mentor. There was no pressure. He was playing hockey again just for fun, like he did when he was a kid playing on the frozen ponds in Verdun. Bartlett didn't mind playing in the Chesapeake League and told the Sun, "It was hockey, and I was keeping in shape, hoping that Terry would give me a call." Bartlett continued to bug Reardon for another shot with the Clippers. He marked time during the winter by helping kids in the neighborhood build an outdoor rink. It even had lights for night scrimmages. According to the Sun, Jimmy would occasionally visit the Clippers' practices at the Orchard, and it would eat his heart out. He continued to ask Reardon to please give him another chance. On January 14, 1972, the Baltimore Sun reported that Jimmy Bartlett was talking about reinstatement after the Clippers' leading scorer, Pete Laframboise, was called up by the California Golden Seals. But Pete's call-up was only for 5 games, and the Clippers were doing just fine with the red-hot scooter line of Bobby Rivard, John French, and Howie Menard. The Clippers had battled back from last place to take the lead in the Western Division, and Bartlett's services weren't needed. On January 30, 1972, British soldiers shot 26 unarmed citizens during a civil rights protest in Northern Ireland in a massacre that is remembered today as Bloody Sunday. On February 21st, President Richard Nixon became the first United States president to visit the People's Republic of China. Nixon's ping-pong diplomacy restored diplomatic ties with China, ending 25 years of no communication or ties with the communist country. While Nixon was in China, Willie Marshall signed a contract with the Rochester Americans and returned to the American Hockey League. After scoring in Rochester's win against Providence on March 9, 1972, Willie Marshall received a standing ovation when he scored his 523rd goal of his AHL career against the Springfield Kings, passing Fred Glover to become the AHL's all-time leading goal scorer. Willie promptly retired a few days later. In 2003, the American Hockey League created the Willie Marshall Award, which is given to the league's leading goal scorer for the regular season. With only a dozen games left in the season, the Baltimore Clippers and Hershey Bears were neck and neck in a tight race for the Western Division lead. Terry Reardon's request to the California Golden Seals to send some players to Baltimore to help them down the stretch fell on deaf ears. Reardon said, Sure, I would have liked to have gotten a couple players, but California has several injuries and like us are fighting for a playoff spot. The only hope we can get now would be to call up an amateur. I'll probably go out to watch Columbus play this week and see if anyone there can help us. According to the Baltimore Sun, Jimmy Bartlett, who had been playing in the local Chesapeake League for the National Brewers, was chomping at the bit to get into action. Reardon was desperate. On March 14, 1972, Jimmy Bartlett attended practice with the Clippers for the first time. On a whim and without anything to lose, Reardon said, "I'm going to have Jimmy work out with the club all this week, then I'll probably make a decision one way or another this weekend." However, when Bobby Rivard became sidelined with a shoulder injury, Reardon was out of options because on the next day rosters would be frozen for the playoffs. So at the last minute, TR signed Bartlett to a 5-game amateur contract. On March 16, 1972, the day after his signing and with only 11 games remaining in the season, Black Bart got a phone call at 5 o'clock from Reardon who told him to come to the Civic Center ready to play in that night's game against the Rochester Americans. The crowd cheered loudly when Bartlett skated out for the warm-up. Jimmy started the game in his usual Clipper spot, sitting on the bench. Bartlett was just sitting there daydreaming.
What if you stepped out on the ice and went in for a goal? I asked myself. It was like in baseball with the bases loaded and the manager looks down at the end of the bench and says to the new guy, "Okay, you get up to bat."
The Clippers were trailing 1-0 when Reardon put Bartlett on the ice for the first time at 10:08 of the first period, moving him in at center behind Howie Menard and John French. A minute later, he got control of the puck behind the Amherst net. Bartlett bounced the puck off of the leg of Rochester's goalie Lynn Zimmerman's leg pad, and it deflected into the net. Bartlett went crazy, shuffling his skates and raising his fists in the air with glee. Jimmy saw very little action in the second period as the Clippers coasted to a 4-1 lead. In the third period, after Serge Aubry replaced Zimmerman in the net, Bartlett positioned himself in front of the Rochester goal just in time to deflect Wally Chevrier's shot into the net with his knee for Jimmy's second goal of the night. After returning to the bench, Black Bart made his final appearance of the game with a little less than 6 minutes to play with Baltimore leading 6-2. A minute later, Bartlett broke in alone against Serge Aubry. He took a shot that the Amherst goalie stopped and then flipped the rebound into the net for the hat trick, with Howie Menard assisting on all 3 goals. The players on the ice mobbed Bartlett. As Jimmy skated back to the Clippers bench, he raised his hands and held up 3 fingers. As he reached the bench, his teammates stood and each one shook his hand as he skated down the row. After the game, Bartlett said his hat trick was the
biggest thrill of my entire hockey career.
Jimmy admitted that prior to the game,
there was unbelievable pressure. I almost felt scared. I tried to ease my tension by telling the boys to relax. Old Bart is back. You can count on me for about 4 goals. Of course, it was just a front I was putting on, and they knew it. But as happy as I was to score that 3rd goal, the thing that had me choking more than anything was the way the fellas all stood up to congratulate me with individual handshakes. It was such a wonderful feeling, something like they all were telling me, "Welcome back, Bart."
After the game, Terry Reardon said, "We always knew Bartlett could score goals. It was only a matter of whether his legs could stand the going." According to the Baltimore Sun, there now appeared hope that Bartlett would be reinstated as a professional and he could help bring the first Calder Cup to Baltimore. Bartlett could give the Clippers some needed scoring punch down the stretch drive. He can also help attendance since he still has a loyal backing. It's hard to find a Clipper fan who is not thrilled by his return. The cry, "Black Bart is back," was heard many times this past weekend in the monumental city. Jimmy Bartlett was no longer number 7. In Jimmy's absence, 21-year-old John French was allowed to appropriate Bartlett's number 7. The number on Black Bart's sweater was now number 9. I remember hating John French for stealing my dad's number. My dad taught me a little song he made up. Un, deux, trois, quatre, cinq, six, sept, Jim Bartlett, Jim Bartlett. What was I supposed to sing now? My dad said, "No problem," and sang, Un, deux, trois, quatre, cinq, six, sept, Riffnet, Jim Bartlett. I don't think that's how you pronounce 8 and 9 in French, but what the hell? At least it rhymed. Rivard soon returned to health and Bartlett was returned to the bench. Playing very limited minutes didn't bother Jimmy, who relished his role as a gunslinger who was deployed when the team was desperate for a goal. Because he didn't have to skate as much,
Maybe I'll play a couple more years, you know.
3 days after his triumphant return, Black Bart scored a third-period goal against Paillet in Providence, and then scored the Clippers' only goal the next night in Baltimore's loss to the Cleveland Barons. On March 26, although Jimmy scored an unassisted goal to tie the game, the Tidewater Wings completely dominated the first period and scoring twice more to give the Wings a 3-1 lead. In the second period, Baltimore came roaring back with goals from Bartlett, Rivard, and Szura as the Clippers came from behind in a 6-4 win. It was Black Bart's 7th goal in 7 games. On April 1st, the Clippers were trailing the Cincinnati Swords 3-0 with only 10 minutes left to play of the game. But after Morrison scored at 11:44 and Laframboise put one in the net less than a minute later, the game's momentum had suddenly shifted. Bartlett then scored the tie-in goal when he knocked in Morrison's rebound at 15:39. Hilliard Graves scored Baltimore's 4th goal of the period in the Clippers' dramatic win over Cincinnati. With the win, the Baltimore Clippers clinched first place in the AHL's Western Division. Pete Laframboise had a phenomenal season. He was named the first-team All-Star and led the Clippers in scoring with 81 points and 37 goals. Joe Szura was just as good with 76 points and 38 goals. Bobby Rivard scored 23 goals, which was his 3rd consecutive year with more than 20. Howie Menard also scored 26 times, a new personal best for the speedy forward. Jim Morrison's steady play on the blue line earned him a placement on the league's 2nd All-Star team. And Jimmy Bartlett, who was used sparingly with very little ice time, somehow scored 8 goals in only 11 games. Backup goalie Jim Shaw impressed Reardon with his clutch play, earning him the starting job in the playoffs over Clippers regular goalie Bob Whitten. In the first round, Baltimore played the Cleveland Barons, which starred former Clippers Gord Labossiere and Fred Speck. In Game 1, the Clippers were trailing 3-2 heading into the third period. After Black Bart tied the score at 7:05 with assists from Rivard and French, former Clipper Gord Labossiere scored in the game's final 6 minutes, and Norm Bowden added another in the Barons' 5-3 victory in Game 1. The next night, French had a hat trick, and Jim Shaw was perfect in Baltimore's 6-0 shutout to tie the series. Jimmy had a brief skirmish with Bowden in the third period after Bartlett was hooked. It was a split decision when the series moved to Cleveland, with Baltimore winning Game 3 3-1, but losing Game 4 5-3. Bartlett wasn't playing on a regular line, but only was seeing limited duty. However, after Dunk Russo tore a ligament in his knee, Jimmy replaced him on his line with Brian Murphy and Hilliard Graves. In Game 5, the fast-skating Mighty Might line of French, Menard, and Bobby Rivard scored 9 times and combined for 19 points in Baltimore's 10-1 blowout. Frenchie's 4 goals tied the playoff record. Menard had a record 7 points with 3 goals and 4 assists, while Rivard merely tied the old record with 6 points of his own. The Barons couldn't recover after this humiliating loss and were eliminated in Game 6 after losing 4-1. The Clippers were heading to the second round of the playoffs for the first time since the 1966-67 season. Bartlett wasn't upset that he was scheduled for only part-time shifts against the Cincinnati Swords.
If he needs a goal, he'll put me out there. I've been coming through.
During the season's final month, Cincinnati was the hottest team in the league and had just swept Hershey in the first round. Knowing how important it was to stop their momentum, Bartlett told the Sun before Game 1,
"This first game is really a big one for both teams."
In Game 1 at the Civic Center, the Clippers manhandled Cincinnati 7-4. Former Clipper Kiki Morrison had a lousy night, losing fights against Brian Murphy and Kent Douglas before he got thrown out of the game in the third period. A fight was scheduled at the Civic Center the next night, but a hockey game broke out. 106 penalty minutes were handed out by the referee. The score was tied at 1 heading into the second period. Rivard scored to give the Clippers the lead with assists from Menard and Bartlett. Then everything went crazy. It was deja vu all over again when Kiki Morrison lost another fight to Murphy and then was thrown out of the game again after punching the linesman. Cincinnati's leading goal scorer, Butch Deadmarsh, was also thrown out for hitting that same official. When that brawl was winding down, Red Armstrong slugged it out at center ice against Rick Dudley, while Teddy McAneely and Joe Robertson were duking it out, and John French and Jake Rathwell were going at it. At that time, there were more players in the penalty box than on the bench. Gauthier and Dufour scored in the third period, and the Clippers were able to hold on to win 4-3 in Game 2. After the game, Cincinnati's coach Floyd Smith was furious that the referees kicked his 2 stars out of the game, while Jimmy Bartlett wasn't even penalized for his participation in the second period's battle royal after he jumped in and joined in the mayhem. They headed back to Cincinnati for the third game. It was the first time Bartlett had played in Cincinnati since he played for the United States National Amateur Champions, the 1952 Cincinnati Mohawks, that was coached by Terry's brother, Kenny Reardon. Cincinnati's John Gould scored in sudden death overtime to give the Swords a 3-2 victory in Game 3, and then the Swords outscored the Clippers 4-1 to easily win Game 4 to deadlock the series. Both teams completely abandoned defensive play in an exciting Game 5 at the Civic Center. Prior to Game 5, Reardon told the Sun, "I use Jimmy in spots. I know that when he gets around the net, he knows how to put the puck in there." Bartlett gave the Clippers a 3-1 lead when he scored in the first period with an assist from Morrison. Baltimore led 4-3 after the first period. After John French got injured, Bartlett was his replacement on his line with Rivard and Menard. In the second period, the Clippers took a 6-3 lead after Dufour found the back of the net, and Bobby Rivard scored his second goal of the game with Bartlett and Menard picking up assists. However, the Swords came roaring back with 3 straight goals and tied the game earlier in the third period. The Clippers took the lead 7-6 after Jimmy Bartlett scored for his second time at 8:56 of the third period. Cincinnati stunned the hometown fans when they scored twice in less than a minute and took an 8-7 lead with 9 minutes left to play. However, Menard tied it up 90 seconds later with assists from Bartlett and Rivard. Clipper defenseman Jean Gauthier, who had only 3 goals during the regular season, broke the tie 20 seconds later. Black Bart added an insurance goal for the hat trick as the Clippers held on to win 10-8. With a 5-point game, Terry Reardon clearly picked the best spots for Bartlett. Game 6, Jimmy Bartlett was penalized after he engaged in a swinging stick fight against Sword defenseman Ray McKay. Black Bart also scored the game-winning goal in the Clippers' 3-1 victory to send Baltimore to the Calder Cup Finals for the first time in franchise history. Yowza, yowza, yowza. The Nova Scotia Voyageurs were the heavy favorites after winning 41 games and finishing in first place in the Eastern Division. On their team, they had Larry Robinson, who was a 20-year-old defenseman who would eventually be remembered as one of the greatest who ever lived. The future Hall of Famer would win 5 Stanley Cups in the 70s while playing for the Montreal Canadiens. Robinson's 722 plus-minus rating is by far the highest all-time plus-minus rating in history, 140 points higher than the player in second place, Bobby Orr. In other words, during 5-on-5 play, Robinson's teams outscored their opponents by 722 goals while he was on the ice. But in Game 1, the only scoring that was done was by the Clippers, who shut out the Voyageurs 2-0 on May 3rd behind Baltimore's brilliant defensive play. When Rivard's shoulder was injured during the game, Jimmy came off the bench and had a strong game as his replacement. According to The Sun, while everyone is marveling at Jim's goal production since he's joined the team, it should be pointed out that he's playing better defense now than he has in quite a few years. Jim was really back-checking last night. Black Bart also assisted on Jean Gauthier's winning goal. Both teams' goalies were brilliant in Game 2, with the game scoreless until the third period. Red Armstrong's third-period goal off passes from Ted McAneely and Jimmy Bartlett set the nearly 7,000 fans on hand crazy. Nova Scotia was able to avoid another shutout when they finally scored in the final minute of regulation. The Baltimore crowd went crazy when Pete Laframboise scored in sudden death overtime to put Baltimore up 2 games in the series. It seemed that the Clippers were finally going to win their first Calder Cup championship. But things quickly took a turn for the worse. Playing at home in Nova Scotia, the Voyageurs easily won Game 3 6-1 and then Game 4 by the same score, with Bartlett scoring Baltimore's only goal. Nova Scotia's goalie, Michel Place, stopped 34 of 35 shots as the Clippers were beaten at home 4-1 in Game 5. After the game, Bartlett said,
"Give the kid credit. He's done a hell of a job. We outshot them tonight, but he turned back the shots. That was the difference. He's been unbelievable."
Facing elimination, the Clippers took a grueling 11-hour bus ride to Nova Scotia. On May 15th, the team had to evacuate their hotel at 8 o'clock the next morning when a large fire broke out on the 7th floor. That night, an exhausted Baltimore team was beaten 4-1 for their 4th consecutive loss, as the Nova Scotia Voyageurs won the Calder Cup. I remember crying when listening to the game on a portable radio. The only solace was Bobby Rivard's second-period goal, which gave him 25 points in the playoffs, tying the AHL record. Although Bartlett played only 11 regular season games for the Clippers, his teammates voted to give him a full playoff share. When Jimmy was asked what his plans were now that the season was over, Bartlett in his own inimitable way stated,
Why, I'm going to be a beer taster, of course.
On the same day that the Clippers were eliminated, a 21-year-old busboy named Arthur Bremer shot and paralyzed presidential candidate George Wallace while he was campaigning in Bowie, Maryland. Although the assassination attempt ended his candidacy, this did not prevent the racist Alabama governor from winning the Maryland Democrat primary the next day. On June 17, 1972, it was reported that there had been a break-in at the national headquarters of the Democratic Party at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. On June 8, 1972, the NHL announced that Abe Pollan, the owner of the Baltimore Bullets, was awarded an expansion team that would join the league in 1974 as the Washington Capitals. The 1972-73 year was the final season of professional basketball in Baltimore. Pollan would move the Bullets to Washington the following season, where they eventually were renamed the Wizards, playing at the new Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland. Because the territorial rights of the new Washington Capitals team extended to Baltimore, any glimmer of hope that Baltimore could eventually acquire an NHL team was now completely gone. When the Clippers' agreement with the Golden Seals expired at the end of the year, the California Golden Seals replaced the Clippers with the Western League Salt Lake City Eagles. The Baltimore Clippers would now be the only independent minor league team in all of hockey. The Golden Seals promoted Pete Laframboise, Hilliard Graves, and defenseman Ted McAneely to the NHL for the 72-73 season. Laframboise scored 37 goals for the Clippers in 1971, but his AHL success was unable to be duplicated in the NHL, where he would score only 33 times in 4 seasons. Ted McAneely would play 2 seasons for California before being demoted to the Central League. However, Hilliard Graves, who scored only 14 goals for the 71 Clippers, would score 27 goals as a rookie for California and would play 9 seasons in the NHL. The Golden Seals lent Howie Menard to their Western League affiliate, the Salt Lake City Eagles. Defenseman Dick Matuzzi was released by the Golden Seals and signed with the Providence Reds before winding down his career as the player-coach for the Rochester Amherst. Prior to 1967, Major League Hockey was a very exclusive club made up of only 6 teams with a little over 100 players. The reason why the NHL expanded in 1967 was because the American and Western Leagues threatened to merge and challenge the NHL as a second major league. By 1972, with the addition of the New York Islanders and the Atlanta Flames, the NHL had grown to 16 teams. In 1967, sport entrepreneurs Dennis Murphy and Gary Davidson created the American Basketball Association. For 8 seasons, the ABA directly challenged the NBA as basketball's second major league, with its red, white, and blue basketball and exciting slam dunking superstars like Dr. J and Connie Hawkins. In 1972, Murphy and Davidson created the World Hockey Association as a second major league and declared war against the NHL's supremacy. Just like Major League Baseball, the NHL had a provision in their standard player contract called the Reserve Clause, which automatically extended players' contracts by 1 year when it expired, allowing them to be owned and controlled by their team for the rest of their careers. This allowed the NHL to suppress players' salaries, which was the lowest of the 4 major sports, with an average salary in 1972 of $25,000. The WHA believed the reserve clause to be unconstitutional and promised much higher salaries than the NHL was paying its players. The floodgates were open when a federal judge refused to enforce the reserve clause, which allowed goalie Jerry Cheevers to abandon the Boston Bruins for the new World Hockey Association. 67 players quit the NHL looking for greener pastures in the WHA. The hockey world was shocked when Bobby Hull left the Chicago Blackhawks and signed a 10-year contract with the Winnipeg Jets for $2.7 million. Suddenly, with the establishment of the WHA with its 12 new teams, in 1972 there were now 28 teams playing Major League Hockey. This was fantastic news for all of the young minor league players whose services were now suddenly in great demand, which quickly drove up the salaries of NHL players. Many of the Clippers were lured away by the promises of lucrative salaries and jumped to the brand new World Hockey Association. John French signed with the New England Whalers and won the Avco Cup, World Hockey's version of the Stanley Cup. Joe Szura jumped to the WHA after he was drafted by the Los Angeles Sharks in the first World Hockey Draft, and in 1973 would win the Avco Cup as a teammate of Gordie Howes on the Houston Aeros. Dunk Russo signed with the Winnipeg Jets, and starting goalie Bob Whitten jumped to the Cleveland Crusaders. And Clipper captain Kent Douglas and Jean Gauthier both inked deals with the New York Raiders. Defenseman Jim Morrison replaced Douglas as Baltimore's captain. Marc Dufour was also drafted by the New York Raiders of the WHA, and he signed a contract for a much higher salary than what he was earning with the Clippers. However, after inking the deal, Dufour realized he was really happy playing for Baltimore, and his wife Hillary was upset about having to relocate to New York with the girls, and that maybe there were more important things to consider other than money. Dufour called Terry Reardon for advice. Reardon told Dufour that he needed to think about job security. The AHL was an established league, and Dufour was gambling his pension and a stable position on the Clippers on a new league that would probably fold in the first season. After talking to Terry Reardon, Dufour immediately signed a new contract with Baltimore for much less money and became the first player from the World Hockey Association to defect back to their former team. Not wanting to take any chances by holding out again, the 40-year-old Bartlett quickly signed a new contract with the Clippers on September 11, 1972. All was right again in the world because Bartlett was once again number 7. Besides Jimmy, Bobby Rivard, Marc Dufour, Brian Murphy, Red Armstrong, Wally Chevrier, Jim Morrison, and Jim Shaw remain with the Clippers for the upcoming season. A couple of former Clipper forwards returned to the team. Gary Swain returned after scoring 26 goals for the Fort Wayne Comets of the International League. Tony Gilligan was back after playing semi-pro for the Thunder Bay Twins in the low-level United States Hockey League. The Clippers added some veteran experience on the blue line with the addition of 34-year-old Mike Mahoney. Mahoney had played 10 seasons for the Hershey Bears, where he had won the Calder Cup in 1969. In 2016, the tough defensive defenseman would be inducted into the Hershey Bears Hall of Fame. The Clippers also obtained 2 veteran forwards from the Springfield Kings. Wayne Schultz played 8 seasons in the AHL, primarily with Cleveland and Springfield. Randy Miller scored 20 goals on 3 occasions during his 8 seasons in Springfield. His wife had a bit of a crush on Bartlett, who with his charcoal black hair she thought looked like Phil Esposito. Baltimore also signed forward Rick Molinaro, who had been playing in the Eastern League. Molinaro was nicknamed Rocky, which was Bartlett's nickname during the 1950s. Finally, Reardon added several young rookies to the team. 24-year-old center Claude Peach averaged 20 goals a season in 4 years playing in the low-level Eastern League before getting a shot in the AHL. 20-year-old center Tom Cassidy came right out of junior hockey and was the Golden Seals' second-round draft pick. 21-year-old defenseman Bob McMahon was the Bruins' 6th-round draft pick in 1971, but he had very limited experience playing in the International and Central Leagues. As a backup to goalie Jim Shaw, Baltimore signed another amateur, Ken Lockett, who had played the previous year for the University of Guelph. In December, Baltimore also swung a deal for 21-year-old defenseman Len Cunning, who came over from Nova Scotia after playing for the Johnstown Jets of the Eastern League. On September 1st, America had a victory in the Cold War without firing a shot when Bobby Fischer defeated Boris Spassky to become the world chess champion. Canada also spanked the Soviets later that month. On September 28, 1972, Paul Henderson scored the most celebrated goal in the history of Canada. With 34 seconds left of the game, Henderson's goal for Team Canada clinched the 1972 Summit Series against the USSR. On October 8, 1972, the Clippers went on top at 11:34 of the first period when Bartlett beat defenseman Ken McPhail and skated in solo on Chico Resch, who he faked out of the net before easily lifting a backhander to the goal for his first goal of the season in Baltimore's 2-1 win over the New Haven Nighthawks. On October 14th, Red Armstrong was arrested after he was involved in a hit-and-run car accident. When a police officer attempted to survey the damage of his car, Armstrong made matters worse when he told the cop that if he touched his car, he would kill him. After his arrest, he was released from his contract with the Clippers. Armstrong would rejoin Rochester for one final season before retiring. After retiring from the Amerks in 1972, Armstrong would return to Ontario to work as a steel worker. A year later, Armstrong lost his balance and died after falling from a great height at work. He was only 35 years old. In 1985, the Rochester Americans retired his number 6 posthumously. Black Bart's aches and pains weren't healing as fast as they once did. Jimmy was receiving Whirlpool treatments from trainer Gump Embro because my back's still a little sore from where some guy cross-checked me a couple of weeks ago. According to The Sun, Physically, Jim's age is starting to show, but mentally, he's getting younger every year. Jimmy was now playing right wing with new line mates rookie Claude Peach at center and speedy Gary Swain at left wing. Peach and Swain were both in their early 20s, and Jimmy was 40, but the generation gap didn't bother Bartlett a bit. Jimmy said,
"I'm really enjoying playing with these two guys. They don't complain. They take suggestions easily, and I've enjoyed trying to help them out with a few little things."
On October 17, 1972, playing on his new line, Jimmy scored twice in the Clippers' 3-3 tie against Providence. After the game, Reardon said, "I have no complaints about the way Jimmy's been going. He is a tremendous threat offensively, and I've noticed a much better attitude this year." Part of Jimmy's improved attitude was due to the pleasure he received from giving high-priced rookies in the league the old "how do you do," which in hockey jargon means beating them with a nifty fake, making them look bad.
"Most of them have been earning 5 times or more what I've been pulling down,"
laughs Bart.
"and I have to admit that I'm getting a kick out of bringing him down to earth a little."
Peach said he couldn't be happier because Gary can really fly and Jimmy was the smartest hockey player he had ever worked with.
Jimmy wasn't political. He was a Canadian and couldn't vote anyway. Kelly, on the other hand, was a very liberal feminist and was a strong supporter of George McGovern. One thing I do know is that my dad was against the Vietnam War. The guys dying in Nam were about the same age as his Clipper teammates. He thought war was stupid and that it was just blind, dumb luck that decided if someone came home as a war hero or in a body bag. He told me it was far better for me to be the drummer in the parade, marching the troops off to the docks as they were sent off to fight. On November 7, 1972, my mom was devastated when Nixon beat McGovern and was reelected in a landslide. On November 12th, Baltimore was humiliated 7-0 by the Virginia Wings. The Clippers' only feature of the game was a third-period fight between Jimmy Bartlett and Virginia's Robbie Federick. According to the Baltimore Sun, it was increasingly apparent that the Clippers lacked the talent of other clubs in the division, talent that only comes from a direct tie-up with the National League affiliate, a tie-up that the Baltimore owners refused. The 1972-1973 Clippers were the worst team in franchise history. During a 33-game stretch between November 8th and January 23rd, the Clippers only won 2 games. On December 8th, the Clippers were trailing Nova Scotia 1-0, but Baltimore coach Terry Reardon called on his ace in the hole, Jimmy Bartlett, early in the second period, and the veteran did not disappoint. Bartlett did his thing to perfection, coming off the bench to score the game-tying goal. The Clippers gained a point in the 1-1 tie. According to Reardon, Jimmy is the type of player that can come off the bench and give the team a big lift. Jimmy knows how to put the puck in the net. He always is tough around the net. Maybe it's the start of something big for us. During bus trips, Coach Terry Reardon always sat in the same seat, the second seat on the right. But when he boarded the bus before the trip to Cleveland, Terry found Bartlett sitting in his seat.
"How about changing your seat for luck?"
Bartlett asked to the astonishment of everyone. Reardon said, "We've got to do something to snap this streak. I'll try anything once." On December 15th, Gary Swain scored in the game's final minute, and the Clippers defeated the Cleveland Barons 4-3, ending a 13-game winless streak. In February, the Cleveland Barons would relocate to Florida and would become the Jacksonville Barons. In December, Kelly had a cornea transplant at Johns Hopkins Hospital to treat her keratoconus eye disorder. While she was recovering, Beverly Rivard did all of the Christmas shopping for her. The hockey wives knew how to stick together. On December 21st, Jimmy was once again Santa Claus at the Clippers' annual Christmas party. As always, fun was enjoyed by all. Well, with the exception of one poor little boy who was frustrated with his lack of skating ability. By Christmas, the Clippers had won only 5 games. On Christmas Day, Terry Reardon stepped down as coach of the team and replaced himself with defenseman Jim Morrison. On December 27, 1972, Bartlett had 3 points in Morrison's first game as the new player coach against the New Haven Nighthawks. However, the Clippers blew a 2-goal lead when they surrendered 3 unanswered goals in the game's final 5 minutes. The heartbreaking 8-7 loss was Baltimore's 9th consecutive loss at home. After the game, Jimmy declared that the team lacked pride. Although Bartlett scored 2 goals, 3 days later the Clippers dropped their 10th straight game at home against the Virginia Red Wings 6-4. On New Year's Eve, Roberto Clemente died in a plane crash while delivering aid to the victims of an earthquake in Nicaragua. On January 3, 1973, the Clippers rang in the new year with a rare point. Baltimore thought they actually had the game won when Bartlett scored a third-period goal to break a 3-3 tie, but they couldn't hold on to the 1-goal lead against the Richmond Robins. After the game, Jimmy said,
"It's kind of funny, but before the game, I had a feeling I was going to score an important goal, and that's the way it turned out."
On that same day, the 43-year-old president of the American Shipbuilding Company of Cleveland purchased the New York Yankees. New owner George Steinbrenner vowed to be a hands-off owner. "We're not going to pretend we're something we aren't. I'll stick to building ships." On January 19, 1973, Johnny Crawford, Jimmy's former coach for the 1955 Calder Cup winning Providence Reds, died after a sudden illness. Crawford was serving as the general manager of the Cape Cod Cubs of the Eastern League at the time of his death. He was only 56 years old.
Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier!
On January 22, 1973, Big George Foreman was crowned new heavyweight champion of the world after knocking out Joe Frazier 6 times in a brutal 2-round beatdown. On January 25th, the Clippers pulled out a 4-2 triumph over the Richmond Robins, thanks in part to some maneuvering by Jim Bartlett. In the second period, Bartlett was feuding with Orest Kindrachuk against the boards, and while most of the players' attention was concentrated on this encounter, Tom Cassidy scored what proved to be the winning goal. With 3 minutes left of the game, Bartlett and Kindrachuk were both coming out of the penalty box after serving high sticking sentences when suddenly Kindrachuk grabbed Bartlett and started swinging. They slugged it out for about 20 seconds before they were separated, and both were given 5-minute fighting majors and 10-minute misconducts. On February 9, 1973, Bartlett scored twice and had an assist in the Clippers' 5-2 win over Richmond. Bartlett's second goal was the 350th AHL goal of his career. Bartlett's milestone goal was a hotly disputed one as Jimmy came around the net on one of his patented dipsy doodle plays and tucked it into the right-hand corner. Throughout his long hockey career, Jim Bartlett has had this favorite move. He picks up the puck, fakes a shot at one side of the net, then swings behind the goal and tucks in the shot. According to The Sun, Bartlett has become a trick shot master. Everybody was so surprised, many weren't certain that puck actually went into the net. According to Bartlett,
"Sometimes this happens. That's why I raised my stick in the air to let everyone know."
Bartlett was mobbed at center ice by his teammates. The Robins were so angry about the goal being allowed, Richmond's defenseman Glenn Irwin was given a 10-minute misconduct for arguing with the referee. Baltimore's game on February 25th against the New Haven Nighthawks ended in a 2-2 tie. With 4 minutes left of the game, Bartlett broke in on the goalie and made his patented move, swinging behind the net looking for the wraparound. But this time, Bartlett's shot hit the post and bounced out of danger to the disappointment of the fans at the Civic Center. On March 2, 1973, the Clippers were blown out 9-0 in Cincinnati. The Cincinnati Swords would completely dominate the AHL, winning a staggering 54 games and the Calder Cup. Cincinnati was led by the league MVP center Billy Inglis, who had 97 points and 40 goals. After he was drafted by the LA Kings in the 1967 draft, the tough-checking forward spent 3 years with Springfield, scoring 26 goals in 1968 and 31 goals in 1969. After getting poached by the Buffalo Sabres in 1970, he scored 24 goals with the Western League affiliate in Salt Lake City in 1971 before moving on to Cincinnati. He would score 34 goals the following season for the Swords before heading to Hershey. After his playing career wound down, Inglis coached the 1978 Buffalo Sabres until he was replaced by Scotty Bowman. Even though Bartlett was a few months shy of his 41st birthday and should have been getting tired, Bartlett got hot in the season's final month. On March 4th, Jimmy scored 2 goals in the Clippers' 6-4 win against Rochester. On March 14th, he had an assist and scored the tying goals in the Clippers' 3-3 tie against the Amerks. On that same day, John McCain was finally released from the Hanoi Hilton. He had been a prisoner of war since October 26, 1967. Bartlett scored on March 16th against Virginia and scored the winning goal in Baltimore's 4-3 win over Nova Scotia. On March 23rd, he scored against Hershey, and on March 25th, scored twice more in the Clippers' 8-2 blowout over the Boston Braves. March 28th, Jimmy scored the Clippers' only goal in their loss against the Hershey Bears. On March 30th, Jimmy scored his 24th goal of the season against Doug Grant at 14:41 of the third period with an assist from Pete Ford, who had been called up from the Eastern League. It was Black Bart's 6th goal in 6 games and his 10th goal in 13 games. It was the 360th goal of his long AHL career. That goal was also Bartlett's 153rd goal as a member of the Baltimore Clippers, which was one more than Sandy McGregor, making him the team's all-time leading goal scorer. On March 31st, 1973, the Clippers' horrible season was finally finished, but it ended on a positive note with a 5-0 shutout over the Virginia Wings. Bartlett and Brian Murphy assisted on Gary Swain's first period goal against goalie John Voss at 15:48. Although the Clippers' last place finish was a letdown, nobody could deny that Jimmy Bartlett had had a hell of a comeback.